Hey everyone, welcome to another video where today we're going to be in Maya using our sweep mesh tool and a couple of the curve tools that are available to us in the package to create some easy wiring and piping and maybe even some things like octopus tentacles and like tree roots and things like that. But basically just want to really show off these tools as well as my personal workflow for working with them, which I believe to be pretty efficient and easy to understand. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So to demonstrate these tools, we're going to go ahead and jump into a fresh scene here, just so we're going to be doing everything from scratch today, so you can follow along with that. Primarily, I guess the first place to show you is where to find these tools. So if you go up here to the Create tab, and also, sorry, make sure that you're in the modeling mode of Maya, so not rigging, animation, or any of the other ones that are available. And then once you're in the modeling one, you're going to look for Create, and then you can see there's this Curve Tools tab here, which will have a bunch of different kinds of curve. So these are very similar and they do very much the same thing, but they can just be preferential, and you can choose one that maybe functions the best way that makes most sense to you. We'll go ahead and cover kind of the differences of those in a second. And then here you can see highlighted in green is the sweep mesh tool. I personally have the mesh tool, the sweep mesh tool, up here on a custom shelf that I've made for myself that has all of the tools that I tend to use pretty often. So it's right there for me. But that is where you would find it if you do not have that. So let's go ahead and start experimenting with some of the different curve tools here just to see the differences between them. Personally, when I'm working with curves, I tend to work in an orthographic view. You can go ahead and go from perspective to this 4 view here by hitting spacebar while hovering over your viewport. And then while hovering over the front down here, I'm going to go ahead and hit spacebar again, and that will maximize that to be our main viewport screen. If we go up here to create, and then curve tool again, let's go ahead and mess with the CV curve tool, but I actually think that CV and EP are very similar. Basically, you would click and make points, and then it will automatically make curves between those. Basically, to demonstrate, when you click on it here, it comes up with a dialog box for different degrees of how much basically you want, how many points do you want to determine the curves that you're getting here. I typically only either would use 1 or 3. So in this case, let's use 1, and you'll see that it basically just makes straight lines from each point that you put down. Everywhere I'm clicking, it's putting a point down, and then it's making a line between those. Just a little tidbit here. If you make a point and then you realize that you don't want it there, but you want it over there, if you middle mouse click and drag, it will transform the last point that you put down. Just kind of a nice thing if you want to do that while also still continuing to draw your curve. So I'm going to hit escape to cancel that curve here, and then just to show off the cubic version as well, if I change my curve degree over to 3, and then start clicking again, you'll see that once we put down 3 curves, it's making, and I guess it's not counting that first one, once you put down the first 3 curves after the initial point, it's going to start making a curve that kind of follows the points that you've so far put down. So you can see that it's a little different. Obviously, it's not just doing a straight line between the points, but it's actually kind of doing like an interpolated curve between those. So I'm going to again hit escape to cancel that, and then we'll go up, and again I just want to show you that the EP curve is pretty similar, has the same kind of dialog box with linear and cubic. I'm not entirely certain if there's a huge difference between the two of these. It might just come again down to preference, and if there's maybe a different way of looking at these points. If I hit enter, for example, to kind of accept that curve, if you right click and then go to control vertex, you can see this is your initial point here, and then everything else is kind of like these like influence curves that you can use to drag out the curves and stuff like that. So that's how you can like modify the curve after the fact, which is part of the power of using the sweep mesh tool to make your wiring and cables and stuff like that, is being able to edit the curve after the fact pretty efficiently and conveniently. So those are those two. The last one that's kind of similar to those is going to be the Bezier curve tool, which is actually, if you've ever used Illustrator or Photoshop, a pretty similar tool to the pen tool in those programs, where instead of just clicking and dragging, instead of just clicking, which is going to make that similar like linear look where it's just making a line from each one to the next, if you click and drag, it's actually going to create a Bezier handle that will allow you to kind of define the curve how you want to. And so this one I think can be really nice if you know how to use it, because it can create some really nice, like you can get this weird like kind of bunny hill look to it that is not as easy to get with the other tools, which kind of inherently make everything a little too smooth. So that one's nice as well. And then I think after the fact, again, if I right click and go to control vertex, you can actually like modify these handles like this. I know you can select the point and like go to the scale tool and you can scale them, which is kind of nice. I'm not sure if there's a way to break them. Like I know in Photoshop and Illustrator, there's a way to like break the handle so that like I can make this one go off on its own without being tethered anymore to this one, but it doesn't look like that's possible, or at least I don't understand how to do that right now. The last one I'm going to go ahead and show you guys is the pencil curve tool, which I actually think is a really nice one for making my wiring and cabling. It tends to be the one I use the most. So we're going to go ahead and set curve degree to 3, and then you'll see once you just start drawing, it literally is just making a stroke that follows your cursor here. If I go ahead and select that, you can see that it's a pretty dense, it makes a pretty dense curve. So what I actually like to do if I use the pencil curve tool is if you select your curve, you go up to this new menu here called curves. You can open up the dialog box for it here, and you can see that there's the number of spans option. So I'm going to set it something like 32 and click apply. And you'll see that it does simplify the mesh. Basically what it's doing, or the curve rather, what it's doing is it's taking all those points, there are probably like 80 or so points on that last curve, and it's setting it to the number of spans that I have here instead. So if I go back and look at the curve tool now, you can see that it's got a lot less than it had before. You can even go back and see, again, it's that. So I don't want to lose too much definition, so maybe something closer to like 64. Gotta make sure I have the right thing selected there. 64 would be closer. Anyway, that is a nice thing it can do. And then also there's this tool where you can smooth out your curves as well. So this won't actually change how many of the points that the curve is made up of, but it will go ahead and kind of smooth out the angles between those. And again, if you open up the, let me undo that real quick. If you go into the dialog box for the smooth tool, there's kind of a factor that'll be how much do you really want that smoothing to affect it. So I could like obviously crank this to like 100, and it's now made a very, very smooth, nicely interpolated curve there. So those are kind of the tools that I would use the most often. Personally, I use either the pencil curve tool to do the wiring and cabling, or if I'm going to use one, I think Bezier is probably the best one just because it has the most kind of control, both doing linear and cubic curves kind of at the same time. Now that we've gotten the introduction of those curve tools out of the way, let's actually get into using them with the sweep mesh tool. So just one more time, I'm going to go ahead and draw out a curve real quick with my pencil tool here. So now with all that done and with the curve selected, I'm going to click on here, or you can go again up to here and click on sweep mesh. And you'll see that instantly it creates this cylinder that's kind of following the curve. When you click on, if we go ahead and open up our outliner here, it creates something called sweep 1. If you select this and then in your attribute editor here, you can either look on the right side there, I think it's this tab as well, or you can hit Control A to kind of toggle between attribute editor and channel box. If you go to the attribute editor and look for the sweep mesh creator tool here, you'll get this dialog box that has a lot of different settings to play with here. The one we're going to be immediately interested in is kind of upping the scale of the curve that was made, or the mesh that was made from the curve rather. So you can like obviously kind of thicken that. You can control how many sides it has. So right now it's showing a cylinder that it has 8 sides, but we can go down as low as 4. And this is kind of a nice thing, depending on how up close and personal you're going to get with the cables. For games and stuff like that, it can be really useful to make a curve that even just has like 4 individual sides here, because when you smooth it all out, it basically looks just as good. Depending on, again, how small it is and how far away it is from the camera. And then there's also a few other things here before we kind of get into the more gritty details of the sweep profiles and things like that. There is, that's the size that we went over. There's the ability to kind of rotate it. It's just uniformly rotating the whole thing. There's the twist, which is not uniformly rotating it. So if we change this to like 8 or something like that, you'll see, and we turn on our wireframe here, you can see that it's actually twisting along the mesh there. So from beginning to end, it's kind of applying a twist over time. And then the last thing here is there's a taper, and there's actually 2 ways to do a taper. You can either control this parameter here, which is basically going to grow or shrink it from beginning to end. So again, this is our beginning point. And if we set this to 0, it's going to get smaller to basically a 0 point at the end here. you can create something like a whip or like a tentacle or like a tree root or anything like that using that, which is cool. And then we can do the same thing in reverse here and add some more definition to our cylinder while we're messing with this. And then if you open up this taper curve dialog window here, you can actually even draw like a custom curve profile, where basically you can see that it's growing and shrinking along with the curve you've done here. So obviously the higher up here it is, the thicker, and the smaller, the thinner. And there's even like, it's going to do this on a per point basis, as you can see. So it did there. And then you can use this here to delete any points in that taper curve profile that you're doing. So again, yeah, that can be kind of a really nice control functionality to be able to get that in there. The last thing that's really going to be nice is the ability to really dial in how many points are being used to make up this curve. Because right now, obviously, this is 20,000 triangles, which is a pretty dense curve, and may not be necessary for what you're looking at. So we can go again down to like 8, or let's actually set the sides to 6 here. And then there's a couple different modes here. So you can do precision, which is basically how efficiently is it going to try to match the curve that it was using as its influence to draw the curve. You can see that there's not much difference in the actual look of it, but it's way denser than it was before. It went from 20,000 to something like, I think that's 1.3 million almost. So I tend not to go to 100% if I'm going to use the precision mode on there. But what I actually tend to use is the start to end tool, which is very similar to the curve tool when you go to the rebuilding the curve and you can choose the number of spans. This is actually just going to show how many divisions it's going to have from beginning to end. So I'll set this usually to something like 64, like a power of 2 of some kind or something like that, which will allow you to really fine tune how many points are being used to make up your curve here. The nice thing about this too is that there's this optimize checkbox here, which will try to kind of get rid of any edge loops that aren't actually affecting the silhouette of the curve here. So that can also be really nice. So you can set something to a higher amount, so like 256 or even 512. And you can see that it's not changing too much except for on those like sharper curves where it really wants to support that new. It's really trying to make sure that we have a good definition of the curve that's being used to make it right now. So that one's good. And then there's distance as well, which is going to try and basically keep a uniform distance between. Let's go ahead and uncheck that. It's going to keep a uniform distance between. So the smaller this one gets, the more dense. Kind of back opposite of the other ones here. That's pretty cool. And then here's the actual the magic here is that if I go up to in my outliner and select the curve tool, I'm going to right click and go to control vertex. And I you can't see it. If you go here, you can turn on your X-ray mode, which will allow you to see the curve through the mesh here. If I go ahead and select that, you can actually in real time edit the curve and it will update the mesh that is tied to it at that point. You can hit B to turn on your soft select. And if you hold B and click and drag, you can change kind of the area of effect, the radius that brush is affecting around the selected curve points. So if I do that now, I can actually edit the entire radius of stuff there. And as I'm editing the curve here, you can see that in real time, it is modifying that mesh, which is really nice compared to if you were to try and make this from scratch on your own by just like moving the polygons on a cylinder. You could do it, but it'd be a lot more painstaking, and more than likely you're going to get some pinching and like non-uniformity in the size of that cylinder. So this is a much nicer way to kind of have Maya do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. It's non-destructible as long as you don't clear the history on either the curve or this here. So if I don't clear the history or freeze transformations or anything like that, because as soon as you do that here, I'll demonstrate it for you. Now when I go to move the curve is now its own thing again, and is no longer having any influence over the mesh itself. If you do happen to clear history, you can go back far enough that it should undo that for you, and you'll still have the ability to do that. Yeah, so that's really where the power of the Sweep Mesh tool comes into play, is that it's non-destructive more or less. And I've been able to get crazy. So again, as long as you don't clear history, you can do some pretty interesting things here. So for example, if I were to turn off my soft select again, I have a tool here where it'll allow me to kind of select a pattern, and then it'll kind of know that pattern and select it along there. So I selected every other third edge here, and it kind of knew to do that. I'm going to hold down Control, right click, two faces, the faces, and you can see that it has now selected all the faces that were adjacent to that edge. I'm going to hit Control E to extrude, and then I'm going to just let that kind of extrude inward a little bit. Or you know what, I don't know, we'll do the opposite. It's going to go out a little bit. So now I got this kind of funky shape going on. What's crazy about this is that I can still edit the control points here. If I can find them. What happened? Oh, that's why I had isolated. So control 1 will isolate whatever you have selected. So I had done that. But anyway, what I was going to show is that I can still modify this curve here, and it's still going to update, even keeping the changes that I did with the extrusion and stuff like that. You can see that it's having a problem as soon as it's basically making new geometry. It hadn't worked with this curvature geometry at the time that I made all the extrusion information to it, and so it doesn't really know what to do there. So it just kind of defaults back to just making it the uniform profile that matches with the scale profile here. Next, I'm going to show you how to use custom geometry to generate our mesh along the curve. Instead of, for example, right now we can kind of choose the sides and whatnot. We're actually going to use this shape here, which will allow us to select a sweep profile to kind of generate that instead. So before we get to that, I'm going to make out 3 discs real quick. Actually, you know what, just to make this a little simpler, I'm going to make a cylinder instead and delete all but the top face. And then I'm going to duplicate that 3 times and go ahead and group those together, or combine them rather. Now, and maybe shrink them down a little bit because it also is going to inherit the size of that. If I go back into here into my sweep mesh that is being made, looks like I broke it, so we're going to go ahead and make a new one. Curve, I'm going to go click my sweep mesh button, change the profile up to something like 5. If I go here to hit custom, it's going to bring up this menu asking for something to look at to make the sweep profile. I'm going to make this type drop down to poly object. Now it's looking for me to make a selection. I'm going to make that selection. You see some crazy stuff happening. I'm going to hit OK. Let's go back into here and reduce this. Let's set this profile to 1 actually. So basically it's going to be referencing 1 for 1, maybe even 0.5. I'll be using 0.5 of whatever this size is. So for example, I can actually change this in real time, and it's going to update that curve. So what's really fun for this is, if you've ever seen any bundled cable packages for anything like that, that's where I think it's kind of fun to do, where you can introduce a twist here, and now you've got something that looks like a rope or whatever, that just easily follows the curve that you've made. I think this is super powerful to make stuff like this. Maybe not for games inherently, but you could do something like this where you make a kind of your high poly mesh to make a rope, and then you can use the same curve to make a second piece of geometry that would be essentially the low poly. And I've never actually tested this before, but I am curious to see if I make another curve with the same, if I make another, yeah, okay, so they stick together here. So you could hypothetically make a low poly and a high poly at the same time here. That's pretty fascinating actually. So you could have, if you were trying to go for some kind of a rope looking thing, you could then bake that down onto the geometry that's also generated. Oh, you know what, I didn't even tell you the most amazing part about all this is, if we open up the UV editor here, it already UV unwraps everything to be perfectly straight, so you don't even have to worry about UVs or anything like that. You can obviously modify them and stuff like that, but all the UVs are even done for you when you make the sweep mesh, which is, this tool is just crazy what you can do with it if you know how to use it. And the last thing I'm going to show you today is the ability to, one, make a curve from a mesh, and then how to use that to make things like pipes and whatnot. So I have another video that I'll link here if you want to go ahead and watch that. That is also in Maya, about making curves that are 90 degrees and snap to a grid. I think that the workflow that I show in that video is still very useful and good, but I also had another thing I could propose here. Let's go ahead and make a cube real quick, and I'm gonna scale it up quite a bit, just so we're good there. And then I don't know, let's just go ahead and kind of fiddle a little bit. I'm gonna make a kind of like a snake design here, just to have some interesting curves and whatnot. And then we can even do an upward curve here just to make sure we show that off as well. So if we go ahead and select every edge that we want to become a pipe 90-degree bend, which I think are those 3 currently, and I'm gonna hit Control B to do bevel, and we'll go up to 12 segments, should be good. And then let's go ahead, and I'm holding down Tab to kind of paint my selection here. Make sure I get all these guys here. I'm gonna go Control, right click to Edges Perimeter, and then I'm gonna deselect all these interior ones. I only want the ones at the bottom here. And I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but basically I've selected all of, this would be basically kind of like the curve that I want to be where my pipes follow. If you go to Modify, Convert Polygon Edges to Curve, we've now just made a curve from the selected edges. And you can see that there's some funkiness that goes on here. So actually what I like to do is with the selected, go to Poly Edge to Curve here and change the degree down to 1. And that should fix it. Basically, it's going to put a curve, it's going to put a point everywhere that there was a face. So it'll basically be like you've converted your polygons to a basically a 1-to-1 curve. And then now if we go ahead and do the sweep mesh tool here and make sure that we have isolation on. Okay. Now you can see that if I up the curve here, it basically has made us a perfect pipe structure that again is exactly where we had that edge. So you could use that really quickly to make a pipe structure that's a little bit more complicated. Instead of having to make 90-degree bends and have like a 90-degree and then copy it all over the place and do extrusions and all that stuff, you can just kind of make a quick mesh. You saw how fast we threw this together, and then we're able to make this from it. And then again, what's really powerful about this is that it's all unwrapped perfectly for you, so that you don't even have to do any of that work or anything like that. And then even better, it still works with the ability to use the custom meshes here. So if we combine these, again, and get rid of these, move them a little closer together, make them a little smaller. We go back into our sweep mesh here, choose custom, do poly object, select these guys here, hit OK. Then you can see that it's now still doing the curve along that, and so it's making some really nice bends. What's really fantastic about this is if, for example, I take this and instead of it being there, you can move it out here. I should have done that with this on screen, but as you move this around, it's actually changing kind of the orientation of stuff. But if you ever have like a modular pipe set where you want pipes to be kind of running in parallel like this, you know, obviously the inner pipes are going to need to be a little thinner than the outer pipes, and it does it automatically for you. Whereas if you only made like the inner one and tried to copy it over and paste it over, the curve would be a little different because the radius of that turn has to be wider for the exterior, for the external pipe structure. So that's, again, another really powerful way to make some nice looking pipes that are going to be really clean, really well constructed. They can align to your grid if you make the correct precautions to do so. And again, yeah, I just think this is a really fantastic tool that it came out, I think, in 2021 of Maya, and there's definitely been some information on it, but I just don't know if everyone's using it to its fullest potential. So that's really what I wanted to highlight here, is just really a lot of the cool things you can do with it that I don't know if everyone is aware about. Using a curve made from a mesh can also be a really nice way to do some piping. If you're like looking at cushions or like pillows and stuff like that, you can see that it does like a really nice job of aligning that tube right to that selected edge. And then the last thing I did want to show off here is that because that curve originally was made from a piece of geometry. If you edit the geometry, the curve actually gets updated in real time, which means that the tube gets updated in real time. So if you do this correctly and in kind of the right order, and again, you make sure not to clear your transforms or anything like that, clear your history and on any of these objects here, it's all non-destructive and can be redone or changed at any point, which again, I think is one of the strongest parts of this new tool. And that's really all I have to show you guys today. Here's just a few other examples of some of the stuff you can make with this tool that I was doing just kind of with fiddling around when making and preparing for this tutorial. But yeah, I think I'm really excited about this tool, and I really hope that you found this useful. If you have any further questions about how to use it, or maybe you're running into some issues, don't hesitate to leave a comment down in the comment below. And then I'm also a huge proponent for kind of using a program as efficiently as possible. So you can see that there's a lot of things in my own workflow that I've done to make sure that I can use this program the way that I want to use it and that it works for me rather than the other way around. So if you have any questions about the workflow that you saw today with me here, again, just any questions at all that you have, I'm more than happy to answer. If you have ideas for other things that could be useful to cover in a video in the future, again, just leave it down below. Otherwise, a like and a subscribe are always super appreciated. I stream over on Twitch. You can find the links for all that stuff in the description below, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Have a good one.